Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I'd always loved camping. There was something about the stillness of the woods, the whisper of the trees, the gentle crackle of a fire. It was peaceful. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. Now, I know better. It started on a cool October weekend with me and my friends, Matt, Sarah, and Jake, hiking deep into the forest, miles away from any semblance of civilization. We were looking for a thrill, something off the beaten path. No cell service, no people, just the four of us and nature. That was the plan. But the deeper we went, the more it felt like we were being watched. The first night, everything seemed normal. We set up camp in a clearing by a small stream, ate dinner, and shared stories around the fire. The sounds of the forest were comforting, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But around midnight, I heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering, carried by the wind. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the breeze playing tricks on me. The next day, things got stranger. We were on a hike, exploring a part of the woods that seemed untouched by human hands. The trees grew denser, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers reaching for us. As we moved further in, we noticed the silence. No birds, no insects. Just an eerie, oppressive quiet. It was like the forest was holding its breath. Matt was the first to say something. "Do you feel that?" he asked, looking around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "Feel what?" Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "Like, we're not alone," he whispered, barely loud enough for us to hear. I glanced around, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. But the silence was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on us. We continued hiking, but we were jumpy, flinching at every snapped twig and rustling leaf. And then we saw it, a shadowy figure just beyond the tree line. It was tall, hunched over, with limbs too long to be human. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, piercing through the gloom. For a moment, it was as if time stood still. We all stared, frozen, as the creature seemed to melt back into the shadows. What the hell was that?" Jake stammered, his face pale. None of us had an answer. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a trick of the light, a figment of our overactive imaginations. But deep down, we knew better. That night, we barely slept. The fire was our only solace, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and twist into grotesque shapes. The whispering returned, louder this time, almost like voices speaking a language none of us could understand. And then the howling started. It was low, guttural, echoing through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. We huddled together, our backs to the fire, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, pointing into the trees. There, illuminated by the firelight, was a figure. It looked like a man, except its face was all wrong. It was distorted, stretched, with skin that didn't seem to fit right. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. "Skinwalker," Matt whispered, his voice trembling. He had told us stories about them before, creatures that could mimic humans, taking on their appearance to lure in unsuspecting prey. I had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just a campfire tale, but now, staring into those empty eyes, I felt the icy grip of fear clawing at my heart. The creature let out a sound, something between a growl and a laugh, and took a step toward us. We didn't wait to see what it would do next. We bolted, running blindly through the trees, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and relentless, like a predator closing in on its prey. Somehow we made it back to the campsite, but the relief was short-lived. Our tents had been shredded, our belongings scattered and torn. The forest had turned on us, and there was no escaping it. We tried to leave, but the path we had taken was gone, swallowed up by the forest. It was as if the woods had rearranged themselves, trapping us within their twisted maze. Hours passed, maybe days. I lost track of time. We were exhausted, our nerves frayed, our minds teetering on the edge of madness. The creatures came for us at night, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their twisted forms lurking just beyond the firelight. We could hear them whispering, calling our names in voices that weren't quite human. And then, one by one, they started to disappear. First Sarah, then Jake. Each time I woke to find their empty sleeping bags and the unmistakable feeling that I was next. I was alone now, surrounded by the shadows, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened to them. Were they taken? Were they transformed? I shuddered at the thought. I don't know how long I've been here. The days blur together and the darkness never seems to end. I can feel them watching me, their eyes burning into my skin. I know they're waiting, biding their time. And I know that when they come for me, there will be no escape. As I sit here writing this, I realize something terrifying. I can hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, approaching from behind. I don't dare turn around. I know what I'll see. I can already feel the cold, skeletal fingers reaching for me, the whispering growing louder, drowning out my thoughts. If you're hearing this, remember the woods are not empty, they never were. And if you venture too deep, they'll take you too. Because once you've seen them, once you've felt their gaze, they never let you go. I look around hoping for a miracle, but there's nothing, just darkness stretching endlessly. And I know that soon I'll be part of it, another shadow lost in the heart of the forest. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was a mix of boredom and a bit of that thrill-seeking foolishness that creeps up sometimes. But there I was, setting up my tent in the darkest, most isolated part of Grizzly Ridge, a remote corner of the state forest that locals didn't even mention, let alone visit. I'd heard stories, of course, rumors about strange things lurking in these woods, but I figured it was all just talk, local legends meant to scare tourists. I should have known better. The sun was setting by the time I got my fire going. The air was thick with that earthy forest smell, but there was something else too, a faint, almost metallic scent that made my skin crawl. As the darkness deepened, so did the silence, an oppressive hush that wrapped around me like a blanket. I tried to shake it off, listening to the crackling of the fire, but the quiet seemed to stretch on, until it felt like a living thing, pressing in on all sides. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first they were just faint glimmers at the edge of the firelight, blinking in and out among the trees. I thought maybe they were the reflections of some animals, deer perhaps or coyotes. But they didn't move like animals. They were too still, too steady, just staring, watching. I called out, trying to scare them off, but they didn't budge. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the dark. Then I heard it, a faint rustling like footsteps circling around me. I grabbed my flashlight, swinging it in a wide arc, but the light just seemed to disappear into the darkness, swallowed up by the shadows. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment everything was still. Then a low, rasping breath echoed through the trees, so close that I could feel it on my skin. My stomach twisted, and I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. But there was no answer, just silence. I took another step back, and that's when I saw it, a figure, half hidden in the shadows, crouched low to the ground. It was tall, impossibly so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes, they were black, so black that they seemed to absorb the light, twin voids that held me in place, unable to move. Then it smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth, sharp and glistening in the faint light. The smell hit me then, a stench so foul that it made my eyes water, a mixture of rot and decay that clung to the air like a thick fog. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved then, quick and fluid, circling me with a grace that was almost mesmerizing, like it was playing with me, savoring my fear. I turned to run, but I heard a voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere in the trees. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was close, too close, and it was followed by a faint shuffling sound. I turned slowly, and there, standing on the edge of the clearing, was a park ranger. He looked old, his uniform faded and torn, his face weathered and pale. But his eyes, they were the same black voids as the creatures, empty and hollow, watching me with a predatory stillness. "You need to leave," he said, his voice cold and flat. "They don't like trespassers." Before I could ask him who they were, he pointed to a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. I didn't want to go that way, but something in his gaze told me I didn't have a choice. I started down the path, glancing back to see the ranger still watching me, his expression unreadable. As I moved, I could feel something following me, a constant prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like a pair of eyes boring into my skin. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the darkness. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, snagging at my clothes, pulling me back. I kept moving, though, too scared to stop, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The footsteps followed, growing louder, heavier, until they were right behind me. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I saw a faint light up ahead, and I broke into a run, desperate to escape. I burst out of the trees and into a small clearing, my heart racing, my lungs burning. I looked around, expecting to see the ranger, but he was gone. In his place was something else, a small weathered cabin, its windows dark, its door hanging open. I approached it slowly, peering inside, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room filled with dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been touched in years. But on the floor, scrawled in dark, almost black letters, were words that made my blood run cold. "They watch, they wait, they hunger." I backed away, my mind reeling, and turned to leave, but the path was gone. The trees had shifted, closing in around the cabin, their twisted branches blocking any escape. And then I heard it, the rasping breath, the faint rustling, the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway of the cabin, was the ranger. But now his face was wrong, twisted and contorted, his skin stretched tight over his skull, his eyes empty and black. He smiled, that same jagged grin, and took a step forward. "You never should have come here," he whispered, his voice a cold hiss. "Now you're one of us." And as the darkness closed in, I realized that I was no longer afraid, because now I could see them too. The creatures, the shadows, the things that lurk in the woods. They were all around me, watching, waiting. And I knew that I would never leave this place, not really. I was part of it now, bound to the forest, to the darkness, to the hunger. So if you ever find yourself in Grizzly Ridge, if you ever feel those eyes on you, turn back. Leave while you can, because once the forest has you, it never lets you go. I always loved camping. There's a peace in the wilderness that you can't find anywhere else. That's why I was out there, deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. Just me, a tent, a small fire, and the forest. I was supposed to meet up with some friends that evening, but they hadn't shown up. I told myself they were just running late, and it wasn't the first time I'd camped solo. I wasn't worried. As the sun set, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was quiet. Too quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just a heavy, suffocating silence. I shrugged it off as my imagination running wild, but that's when I heard the first noise. It was like a low growl, deep and guttural, echoing from somewhere in the distance. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just some animal prowling around, but the growl had an edge to it, something that made my skin crawl. I kept the fire burning brighter and tried to focus on the flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift around me, creeping closer with each passing minute. I told myself to calm down, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far heavier than any animal I knew. I called out, thinking maybe my friends had finally arrived, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped, and then silence. That's when I saw him. A park ranger. His uniform looked right, but something about him didn't. His eyes were wrong. They were wide, almost too wide, and they reflected the firelight in an unsettling way. He stood just outside the ring of light, his face barely visible, and when he spoke, his voice was hollow, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his gaze piercing through the darkness. I tried to explain that I was waiting for my friends, but he just shook his head slowly, his eyes never blinking. "It's dangerous. This place. It's theirs." I asked him what he meant, but he just stood there staring at me. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked back into the darkness. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a strange, morbid curiosity, but I just sat there staring after him. The night wore on, and I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Rustling leaves, distant whispers, the snap of twigs, and then the growl again, closer this time. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, and pointed it into the trees. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. I flashed my light on it, and it froze. Its face was human but twisted, like someone had stretched the skin too tight over its bones. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, hungry light, and I could see something dark and viscous dripping from its mouth. My heart pounded as I scrambled back into my tent, zipping it up as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me. I could hear it moving closer, the crunch of leaves under its feet, the low growl vibrating through the air. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but then I heard a voice, a familiar one. It was the park ranger again. "You can't hide from them," he whispered, his voice coming from all around me. "They know you're here. They always know." I clutched my flashlight like it was a lifeline, willing myself to stay quiet, to stay still. And then, everything went silent. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. I thought maybe they'd left, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was my friend's voice, calling my name. "Hey, it's just us, we got lost." It sounded wrong though, too cheerful, too normal. I knew it wasn't him. My friends wouldn't just show up like that in the middle of the night without a single flashlight. But then I heard them, all their voices calling my name, getting louder and louder until it was a cacophony of familiar sounds, all blending together into one horrible chorus. I unzipped the tent, peeking out just enough to see shadows moving around the campsite. They were shifting, morphing, like they couldn't quite hold their shapes. I watched, horrified, as one of them stretched into the form of the ranger, and then another morphed into something with impossibly long limbs and glowing eyes. It was like they were trying on different skins, different faces. That's when I remembered the legends, skinwalkers, dogmen, creatures that could mimic the voices and faces of humans, drawing them in before they attacked. I'd heard the stories, but I never thought they could be real. Yet here I was, trapped in the woods, surrounded by them. I grabbed my things, barely taking the time to pack, and started running, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from them. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing in the darkness, their voices calling out my name in that same chillingly familiar tone. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs felt like they would give out, and just when I thought I was safe, I saw him again. The park ranger, standing in my path, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "You can't escape," he said, his voice splitting and warping until it sounded like a dozen voices all at once. And then I realized there was no ranger, no cryptid, not in the way I thought. It was them all along, and they weren't just mimicking humans. They were becoming them. They'd found me, and now they had everything they needed. When the search party found my campsite a few days later, they said they saw me, said I looked dazed, like I didn't know where I was. They brought me back to town, but they kept asking me these questions. strange ones like where I'd come from and how long I'd been there. I didn't understand at first, but then I saw my reflection, and I knew. I knew why they were asking. I knew why my skin felt tight, why my limbs felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. I knew because I was one of them now, or maybe I always had been. I've never been the kind of guy to scare easily. You don't become a park ranger in the wilderness of northern Montana if you're afraid of being alone in the woods. But what happened during my last overnight patrol, it's changed me. There are things in these woods that don't belong in this world, things we're not supposed to understand. It was late fall, just before the snow was set to blanket the mountains. The pines were thick, the air crisp and cold, and the daylight barely lasted a few hours. I was sent out to check on a remote part of the park where hikers had reported strange noises, howling, strange echoes, and what they described as whispers in the wind. Whispers. I scoffed when I first heard it. Probably some over-imaginative campers, spooked by the isolation, but orders were orders, so I packed my gear, loaded my rifle, and set out for a 2-night solo patrol to investigate. I wasn't too concerned. I'd dealt with bears, wolves, and even mountain lions before. This wouldn't be any different, or so I thought. The first night was quiet enough. The wind picked up around midnight, making the trees sway and creak, but nothing unusual. I set up camp at the base of a ridge, a good vantage point to observe the surrounding forest. The stars were out, and despite the cold, there was a sense of peace. The only sound was the crackling of my campfire and the occasional rustle of pine needles in the breeze. That peace didn't last long. Around 2 a.m. I woke up. I didn't know why at first, just a sudden jolt from deep sleep into full alertness. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. The wind had died completely. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and then I heard it. A whisper. Not like the wind through the trees. No, this was a voice, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It sounded like it was coming from just outside my tent. I froze, straining to listen, every hair on my body standing on end. Come out. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something off about it. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the handle of my knife under the blanket, heart racing. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed and the whispering stopped. I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe some far-off animal call. I wasn't going to let a little sound scare me out of a good night's sleep. The next day, I hiked deeper into the forest, keeping an eye out for tracks or signs of anything unusual. Nothing. The woods were dead quiet, more so than they should have been. I should have heard birds, squirrels, something, but it was like the entire forest had gone mute. Still no signs of any disturbances. By the time the sun began to set, I was tired and frustrated. Another night. Then I'd report back. Probably chalk it all up to paranoia. I set up camp in a different location that night, closer to a river. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was comforting. I built a small fire and settled in, determined to get some sleep. But just as I was drifting off, it happened again. The whisper. This time it was clearer, closer. Come out. We're waiting. My blood turned to ice. It was as though the voice was right outside my tent, no more than a few feet away. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the inside of the tent. I listened. No footsteps, no movement. Just the whispering. I grabbed my rifle, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow around the clearing. The trees loomed tall and still, their branches like skeletal fingers against the starless sky. I swept my flashlight through the trees, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the forest. Over here, the voice whispered again from the direction of the river. I whipped around, shining the light toward the sound, but all I saw were the trees and the glint of moonlight on the water. I wanted to call out, demand whoever it was to show themselves, but something stopped me. Some deep, primal instinct told me that if I spoke, if I acknowledged the voice, something terrible would happen. That's when I saw them, two figures standing just at the edge of the clearing. At first I thought they were people, tall, humanoid shapes, barely visible in the darkness. But as I focused the light on them, my stomach twisted in horror. They weren't people. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their skin, if you could call it that, was pale and stretched tight over bones that seemed to jut out at odd angles. Their faces... God, their faces were wrong. No eyes, just dark hollows where eyes should be. And their mouths, twisted into wide, unnatural grins that stretched far too wide. One of them raised a hand, its fingers unnaturally long, and pointed at me. "Come join us," it whispered, though its mouth never moved. I backed away, rifle trembling in my hands. The figures didn't move. They just stood there watching. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at those things, but eventually I forced myself to move. I grabbed my pack, doused the remnants of the fire, and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station. It was dawn by the time I made it back, breathless, cold, and drenched in sweat. I told my supervisor what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but he just gave me that look. You know the one. The look that says, "You've been in the woods too long." I don't go out there alone anymore. Hell, I don't even stay after dark if I can help it. Those things, whatever they were, they're still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when the wind dies down, I swear I can still hear them whispering. "Come join us." I don't know what they are, but one thing's for sure. They know my name. I'd been planning the trip for months. A solo hike along an old, barely used trail that wound through the rugged mountains and dense forests of the northern ridge. The trail was unmarked, almost forgotten, and that was exactly what I wanted. It was a chance to get away from everything, to truly disconnect. I set out early, the morning sun casting a soft golden light over the forest. The air was fresh, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine. For the first few miles, everything was perfect. I walked in silence, surrounded by towering trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. The trail twisted and turned, narrowing as I went deeper into the woods. I felt like I was stepping into another world, one that hadn't been touched by human hands for a very long time. By midday, I reached a small clearing and decided to rest. I ate a quick meal and checked my map, but something about it seemed off. The landmarks didn't match up with what I was seeing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd taken a wrong turn. I chalked it up to my own inexperience and kept moving, convinced I'd find the right path soon enough. But as the hours passed, I started to notice subtle changes in the forest. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled in unnatural ways. The air turned heavy, filled with an eerie silence that swallowed up the sounds of birds and insects. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, an old wooden sign half buried in the ground, the paint faded and peeling. I brushed away some dirt and squinted at the faded letters. Devil's Hollow. The name struck a chord somewhere deep in my memory. I remembered hearing something about it, a legend maybe, or a warning, but I was too far in to turn back now. As I pressed on, I came across strange things. Stones piled in small stacks along the trail, each one balancing precariously. At first I thought they were markers, but they seemed too deliberate, almost like offerings. I walked a little faster, telling myself it was just some odd local tradition. But then I found the footprints. They were large, impossibly large, with clawed toes that dug deep into the earth. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These weren't human. I froze, listening, but there was only the silence, heavy and oppressive. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't remember the way I'd come. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes scanning the shadows, every nerve on edge. As the daylight began to fade, I stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin nestled between the trees. The wood was rotting, and the windows were covered in thick grime. I thought about passing it by, but the shadows were growing longer, and I needed shelter. The cabin was worse inside. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the wood in a language I didn't recognize. I stepped further in, my flashlight illuminating more bizarre markings, and noticed something on the floor, a tattered journal. I picked it up and with a trembling hand began to read. The entries were frantic, scrawled in barely legible handwriting. They told the story of a man who had hiked this trail years ago, drawn by the same desire to escape, to disappear. He'd written about the stones, the silence, and the footprints. His last entry was the worst of all. "It's watching me. I can feel it in my bones. I tried to leave, but every path brings me back to this cursed cabin. I see it in the shadows, its eyes glowing. I don't know how much longer I can keep it at bay. If you find this, please, don't look into its eyes." I dropped the journal, my heart pounding. I could feel it, that same presence he'd described. I turned to leave, but as I stepped outside, I saw it. Just beyond the trees, a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. They were impossibly tall, staring down at me unblinking. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The creature stepped forward, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was massive, with limbs that looked almost human, but stretched and distorted, like it had been molded from shadows and nightmares. Its face was a twisted amalgamation of animal and human, with sharp teeth that glinted in the dying light. I forced myself to look away, remembering the journal's warning. I ran, stumbling through the trees, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from those eyes. But every time I thought I'd gotten away, I'd find myself back at the cabin, the same journal lying on the floor, the same symbols staring back at me from the walls. I don't know how many times I tried to escape that night. The creature followed me, its footsteps echoing through the trees, always just behind me, always watching. I lost all sense of time, my world shrinking to a twisted loop of fear and despair. At some point, I must have blacked out because I woke up at the edge of the trail, just as dawn was breaking. The cabin was gone, the forest around me calm and quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. But the footprints were still there, clawed and impossibly large, leading away from me into the woods. I never went back to that trail. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with people, with noise, anything to drown out the memory of those eyes. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still see them, glowing in the darkness, waiting, watching. And I know that if I ever step into those woods again, I won't make it out. Because the forest doesn't forget, and neither does whatever hunts within it. It was late in the season, just as the leaves were starting to change, when I got the call to patrol Pine Ridge. The park was empty, as it usually was this time of year, and the tourists had long since left. This stretch of the forest was always the quietest. People said it was because of the remoteness, but I'd heard other theories. The locals spoke of Pine Ridge with a kind of reverence, like it held some ancient secret they didn't want to disturb. I didn't pay much attention to their stories. Ghosts, creatures, spirits. Every park had its tales, and I'd yet to encounter anything that wasn't explainable. Still, I felt a strange tension as I hiked up the trail that night, the air unnaturally cold and thick with the smell of damp earth. I kept telling myself it was just the season, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. It wasn't long before I noticed the sounds. At first, it was just the creaking of the trees, which was normal enough, but soon it turned into something more, a distant scraping, like claws raking against wood. I paused, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a low, persistent noise that set my nerves on edge. I'd never felt truly afraid in these woods until that moment. I pulled out my flashlight, casting it in a slow arc around me, illuminating the trunks and twisted branches. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its body was hunched, its limbs too long, fingers ending in sharp points that seemed to scrape the bark of the trees as it moved. I called out, hoping it was just a person, maybe a lost camper or a hunter. But the figure didn't respond. It stood there, frozen, its head tilting slightly as if to listen. I raised my light higher, trying to get a better look, but it backed away, melting into the shadows. I could still hear that scraping noise, though, growing fainter as it retreated. I decided to follow it. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or a sense of duty. After all, this was my territory. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The trail had vanished, replaced by an overgrown path that twisted and turned in unnatural ways. I felt disoriented, but I kept going, driven by some unexplainable compulsion to find the source of the sound. I came to a small clearing, and that's when I saw them, figures, more of them, moving in slow, jerky motions around a large, ancient tree in the center. They looked almost human, but there was something wrong about their proportions, the way their limbs stretched unnaturally and their heads tilted too far to one side. They were scratching at the tree, their fingers digging into the bark, pulling it away in long, thin strips. I took a step back, but one of the figures turned, its hollow eyes fixing on me. They were black, like pits, with no light or reflection. It opened its mouth, and I expected a scream, a howl, something. But instead, I heard my own voice. It was repeating something I'd said earlier, words I'd spoken into the empty forest, now coming back to me in a hollow, mocking echo. I belong here. I belong here. I felt a wave of nausea as the realization hit me. These things were mimics, creatures that could take on voices, repeat them, distort them. I tried to move, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sight of them. And then, as if noticing me for the first time, they all stopped, turning in unison to face me, their mouths moving in eerie synchronization, repeating my words in a haunting chorus. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way and I was falling. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I realized I'd tumbled into a pit, a hollow in the earth that had been hidden by leaves and branches. As I struggled to my feet, I saw what lay around me. Bones, countless bones, scattered across the dirt floor. Human bones, animal bones, all jumbled together, some so old they crumbled to dust at my touch. I tried to climb out, but the sides of the pit were too steep, too slick with moss and dirt. I could hear the creatures above me, whispering, scraping, moving closer to the edge. One of them peered down at me, its face stretching into a grotesque grin as it reached down, extending one of its unnaturally long fingers toward me. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the side of the pit, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw something even worse. Among the bones there were pieces of fabric, scraps of park ranger uniforms, and a name tag, tarnished and barely readable. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was my name. That's when I understood. This wasn't just some pit, it was a grave, one I had been to before. I looked down at my hands, and for the first time I noticed how thin they were, how pale, almost skeletal. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, and I remembered things I shouldn't have been able to remember. The feeling of being trapped, the sound of my own voice echoing back at me, distorted, twisted. I had been here before. I had died here before. The creatures above me began to move, their whispers filling the air as they crawled down into the pit, surrounding me, merging with me, pulling me back into the shadows. I felt myself fading, becoming part of the forest, part of the endless repeating cycle of horror that kept these woods alive. And as the darkness closed in, I realized the truth. I was not the ranger. I was the creature, the mimic, the echo that haunted these woods. And now, I was just waiting for the next ranger to come along, to fall into my trap, to join me in the endless nightmare of Pine Ridge. The forest was alive, feeding on fear, on memories, on those who dared to venture too deep. And now, I was part of it, a whisper in the woods, forever calling, forever waiting for the next soul to take my place. I've always loved the forest. I find peace in the way the trees stretch up into the sky, blocking out the world beyond. So when my friends backed out of our annual camping trip last minute, I decided to go alone. I figured a weekend in the deep woods would do me good. Some time away from the noise, away from the emails and the endless texts. I arrived just before dusk, parked my truck at the edge of the trail, and hoisted my pack over my shoulder. There's a certain thrill in walking through a dense forest with nothing but your instincts to guide you. I hadn't picked a specific campsite, just planned to wander until I found somewhere that felt right. A couple hours in, I found a small clearing surrounded by pines. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in as night fell. The forest seemed alive, the chorus of crickets and the distant hoots of owls filling the air. But it was the silence between those sounds that caught my attention. It was heavy, suffocating, like the woods were holding their breath. I was starting to drift off when I heard something moving, a snap of a branch, then another. I opened my eyes and scanned the edge of the clearing, but I didn't see anything. I brushed it off, figuring it was just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Just as I convinced myself it was nothing, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, too deep to be any animal I'd ever heard. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. They were too high off the ground to belong to a deer, too large to be anything else I could name. I fumbled for my knife, the only weapon I'd brought, and pointed it in the creature's direction. The eyes didn't move. They just stared, unblinking. The growling stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The eyes blinked out, and I was left alone in the clearing. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed by the fire, knife in hand, my back to a tree. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I thought about packing up and heading back to the truck, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, I was still on edge, but I pushed forward with my plan. I hiked deeper into the woods, hoping that if I put enough distance between me and whatever I'd seen, I'd feel better. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were no birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was like the forest had been drained of life. Then, I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to find. A small shack hidden between a cluster of trees. It looked abandoned, the windows broken, the door hanging off its hinges. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw strange symbols carved into the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they made my skin crawl. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, a faded map of the forest with strange markings. I studied it, trying to make sense of it, when I heard a noise behind me. I turned, and standing in the doorway was a park ranger, or at least it looked like a park ranger. His face was pale, his eyes dark, and there was something wrong about the way he stood, too still, like he wasn't breathing. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "I was just exploring," I managed to stammer. He stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving mine. "This place isn't safe. You need to leave." There was no arguing with him. I nodded, grabbed my pack, and hurried out of the shack, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked away, I glanced back and saw him watching me from the doorway, his face expressionless. I was more than ready to head back to my truck, but when I reached the trail, I realized I was lost. The map in my head didn't match what I was seeing. I could have sworn I'd followed the same path back, but the trees seemed to have shifted, the landscape foreign and unfamiliar. I tried to retrace my steps, but the deeper I went, the more the forest closed in around me. And then I saw them. The same eyes from the night before, watching me from the shadows. I backed away, heart racing, and that's when I heard footsteps. Heavy, lumbering footsteps coming toward me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't breathe. I stumbled into another clearing, and there, standing in the center, was the park ranger. Only now I could see what was wrong with him. His skin was peeling away, revealing patches of fur and clawed hands. He wasn't human, not anymore. He grinned, his teeth sharp and jagged. "You're not the first, you know. The forest takes what it wants." I turned to run, but something else blocked my path. It was tall, covered in matted fur, its face like a twisted blend of human and dog. The dog man, they call it. Though seeing it in the flesh, it was so much worse than I'd imagined. Its eyes were the same as the ones I'd seen that first night. Cold, unblinking. They closed in on me, their voices echoing through the trees, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I knew then that I wasn't getting out. The forest had chosen me, and there was no escaping it. As they closed in, I remembered the symbols in the shack, the strange markings on the map. This place wasn't just any forest. It was a hunting ground, a place where creatures older than time lurked, waiting for their next victim. I'd wanted to be alone to escape the noise, but I didn't realize that out here, in the deep woods, alone was the last thing you wanted to be. And as the forest closed around me, I understood. This place wasn't just alive. It was hungry, and I was its next meal. I had always loved camping. There was something about being far away from the city, with nothing but the quiet rustling of the trees and the crackling fire, that made me feel at peace. So when my friend Jack invited me to join him for a weekend deep in the forest, I didn't hesitate. We'd camped before, but this time felt different. He'd found a spot way off the beaten path, nestled near a forgotten lake. We arrived late in the afternoon, the golden sunlight spilling through the canopy of towering pines. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. No other campers in sight. It was perfect. As we set up camp, the only sounds were the birds above and the occasional rustle of the wind. By the time night fell, a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest floor, creeping between the trees like ghostly fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I pushed it aside. Probably just my imagination. Jack was laughing, joking about the horror movies we watched too much of, and it helped lighten the mood. For a while. The fire flickered as we sat in silence, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythm. The crackle of the flames, the chirp of distant crickets, and the faint whisper of the wind were comforting. But then a new sound pierced the stillness, a low guttural groan, almost like the moan of a dying animal coming from deep within the woods. Jack looked at me, his smile fading. "What do you think that was?" I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just a deer or something." But as the minutes passed, the sounds grew louder. Not just the groaning, but twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Someone was moving out there, and they were getting closer. I strained my ears, focusing on the sounds, but it was like whatever it was knew how to stay just beyond the edge of the firelight, concealed by the swirling fog. "We should check it out," Jack said suddenly, grabbing a flashlight. I wasn't so sure. Every instinct screamed at me to stay by the fire, but I didn't want to look like a coward. "Yeah, let's go." We stepped into the forest, the darkness immediately swallowing us. The beam of Jack's flashlight cut through the mist, but it barely penetrated the dense blackness beyond. The sound had stopped. We wandered for a while, listening, but all we could hear was our own breathing and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Then, without warning, the air changed. It felt thicker, heavier. There was a strange smell, like something rotting, and I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, just nothing. "Jack," I whispered, but he didn't respond. I turned and realized he wasn't beside me. Panic surged through my chest. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight across the trees, but there was no sign of him. "Jack," I called out, louder this time, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. I ran back toward the campsite, my breath quickening. The fog had grown thicker, the trees bending in ways that felt unnatural, their shadows long and distorted. Finally, I broke through the tree line, back into the clearing. The fire was still burning, but Jack was nowhere in sight. That's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the fog, standing completely still. It was tall, too tall to be Jack, and its limbs were unnaturally long, almost stretched. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. Even in the dim light, I could see that its face wasn't right. Its eyes were hollow, and its skin seemed to hang off its bones like wet paper. It let out a low, guttural moan, the same sound we'd heard earlier, and started moving toward me. But not walking. It was gliding, smoothly, silently, through the mist. I backed away, nearly tripping over the fire pit, and turned to run, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jack, lying on the ground, face down, his body twisted in a way that no living person could survive. But it wasn't Jack, at least not anymore. His body twitched, then started to move, slowly pulling itself upright. His head lolled to the side, and his eyes, they were gone. Just empty sockets staring into nothingness. The figure was closer now. I could feel it behind me. Its breath, if it even breathed, chilling the back of my neck. I turned, but it was too late. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, trees whipping past as I ran, a deep, unearthly laugh that echoed in my ears, and that same rotting smell filling my lungs. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but somehow I did. I didn't look back, not once. It's been days since then, and I've barely slept. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that groaning, feel that presence watching me. I know it's still out there, and I think it's getting closer. I always thought I was a seasoned camper. I'd been in the woods more times than I could count, both alone and with friends, and the idea of nature didn't scare me. In fact, it was where I went to clear my mind. But that all changed after last summer. It was supposed to be a quick solo weekend trip. I had found a secluded spot about 10 miles off any trail in a national forest that stretched for hundreds of miles. No campsites, no tourists, just pure wilderness. I wanted the isolation, the quiet. I wanted to escape from the noise of the city and all the stress that came with it. The first day was uneventful. I hiked most of the afternoon, found a nice clearing near a small stream, and set up camp. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the stillness. No cars, no voices, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I had wanted. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside, just enough light to keep the darkness at bay. I fell asleep almost immediately, the exhaustion from the hike catching up with me. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The woods were quiet, and the fire had long since died out. My small tent felt stifling, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I thought maybe it was a sound that had woken me, something out of place. And then I heard it again, a faint, distant sound, not the usual rustling of animals, not the wind through the trees. It was singing, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was the kind of melody you'd hear on an old record, slow and haunting, and it sent a chill down my spine. I lay there, completely still, straining to listen, convinced that I was imagining it. But no, it was real. It was faint, but getting closer. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe there were other campers nearby, but I knew that wasn't possible. I had hiked deep into the forest, far from any marked trails. I hadn't seen another person all day. The singing grew louder, though it remained eerie and soft, as if carried on the breeze. I unzipped my tent just a little and peeked out. The clearing was empty. No fire, no light. Nothing but the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. The singing stopped. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of what I had heard. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard something new, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I turned off my flashlight. I didn't want to be seen. The footsteps were heavy, crunching over dried leaves and sticks. They paused every few steps, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was listening, waiting for something. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming at me to do something, to run, but I couldn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the edge of the clearing, expecting to see someone or something step out of the darkness. But no one did. Instead, the footsteps stopped and the singing resumed, louder this time, closer. It was the same eerie, haunting melody, but now it felt like it was all around me, echoing through the trees. I don't know how long I sat there listening, too terrified to move, but eventually, the singing began to fade again, retreating into the woods. The footsteps resumed briefly before disappearing entirely. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in my tent, clutching my flashlight and knife, listening to the forest for any sign of the singing or footsteps returning. But the rest of the night passed without incident. At first light, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. My body was stiff from fear and lack of sleep, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, the memory of the singing played over and over in my mind. It was haunting, familiar, like something from a dream, and it left a knot of unease in my stomach. About halfway back, I noticed something strange. The trees looked different. Not in the way that nature changes as you move through the forest, but wrong. At first I couldn't figure out why, but then I realized the trees around me were scarred. Deep gouges in the bark, long and jagged, as if something had been dragging its claws through them. I stopped, heart racing again, and looked closer. The marks were fresh. Some of them had bits of bark hanging loose, the wounds still raw. They followed a path leading deeper into the woods, away from my route. I didn't follow them. I kept walking, faster now, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, safe, surrounded by the comforting sounds of the parking lot. That was the last time I went camping alone. Whatever I heard in those woods, whatever left those marks in the trees, it wasn't human. And it wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I always loved the outdoors. There was something about the wilderness that felt honest, just you, nature, and the quiet hum of life beyond the buzzing cities. So when I found an isolated camping spot deep in the woods, far from the usual beaten trails, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It took me hours to hike there. The forest thickened, and by the time I arrived, the trees seemed almost alive, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. It was perfect. No other campers, no noise, just pure solitude. I set up my tent near a clearing close to a small creek, the babbling water offering some comfort. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees, so I quickly gathered some firewood before the forest swallowed the light completely. As night fell, the air turned cool. The crackle of the fire kept me warm, but that first hint of unease settled in my gut. It wasn't anything specific, just the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off, blaming it on the isolation. It had been months since I'd been anywhere this remote, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. Around midnight, just as I was dozing off in my tent, I heard it, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up listening, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. It could have been a deer or a raccoon. I told myself that as I strained to hear over the pounding of my own heart. But there it was again, a faint crunching of leaves like footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped out, trying to control my breathing, sweeping the light back and forth. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. The sound of my voice echoed through the forest. but there was no response. I stood there for what felt like hours just listening, but the forest was silent, unnaturally so. No insects, no wind, nothing, just the quiet press of the night. Reluctantly, I crawled back into my tent, convincing myself that whatever it was, it had gone. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every shift of the wind sent a new wave of paranoia through me. At some point I drifted off, but I woke to the feeling of being suffocated, a heavy pressure on my chest. My eyes shot open, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed, but my body was paralyzed. In the dim light of the dying fire, I saw something or someone standing at the entrance of my tent. A tall, shadowy figure, its head cocked slightly, as if observing me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it came, the pressure lifted and I gasped for air, sitting up and frantically shining my flashlight in every direction. The figure was gone. The forest was silent, save for the crackling remnants of the fire. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, every muscle tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the figure didn't return. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. This place didn't feel right anymore. I packed my gear and started the long hike back, but the trail felt different. The trees, once inviting, now seemed to close in on me. The forest felt like it was breathing, alive with something unseen. I quickened my pace, heart racing, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to me. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail was wrong. I'd been following it for hours, but instead of leading me back to the main road, it looped around. I found myself back at the same clearing where I'd camped the night before. My stomach dropped. I hadn't taken a wrong turn. I knew these woods. But somehow I was right back where I started. The fire pit I'd built was still smoldering, and my footprints from the morning were fresh in the dirt. Panicked, I grabbed my map, but it was useless. The landmarks didn't match. The trees twisted into shapes that didn't belong, and no matter which direction I walked, I kept ending up in the same place. I spent the entire day trying to escape, but the forest wouldn't let me go. By the time the sun began to set again, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and desperate. The shadows lengthened, and with them came that familiar sense of being watched. As night fell once more, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. I knew, deep down, that the figure from last night would return. And it did. I saw it standing just beyond the firelight, tall and impossibly still. But this time, there were more of them. 3, maybe 4, each standing in the shadows watching me. I screamed, throwing rocks and shouting, but they didn't move. They just stood there watching, waiting. That's when I realized I wasn't lost. I was never lost. They had brought me here. They wanted me here. As the figures slowly stepped into the light, their faces, or what should have been faces, were wrong. They were twisted, featureless, as if someone had erased their identities. And that's when the truth hit me, hard and cold. They weren't watching me. They were waiting for me to join them. The fire flickered, and in that moment I knew there was no leaving this forest. I was already a part of it.